New week, we give thanks to God for the gift of life. Today being the 21st day of the month of June, on the church's calendar is the 12th Sunday of the year. The first reading from Jeremiah chapter 20, from verse 10 to verse 13, and the gospel reading, Matthew chapter 10, from verse 26 to verse 33. These two readings generally talk about persecution. And for those of us who may have some knowledge of the history of Christianity, when the word persecution comes to mind, especially in relation to the life of the early Christians, we may be tempted to think of persecution as something that comes from outside or from without. But this is a very narrow-minded understanding of that word. And of course, we know in Matthew chapter 10, verse 36, Jesus says that one's enemies are members of his or her household. Let us not just allow this very statement of Jesus to make us become very suspicious of those close to us. But the point that the readings of this Sunday are making is that God's unfailing protection for those who stand for truth and goodness, those on the side of truth and goodness, God's unfailing protection is always there. So the readings are not trying to make us become unreasonably defensive or suspicious of certain persons, but they are reassuring us of God's unfailing protection for us, inasmuch as we remain on the side of truth and goodness. The first reading from the prophecy of Jeremiah begins from the 10th verse of chapter 20 of that prophecy and ends at the 13th verse. But when we go to the 7th verse of that very chapter, Jeremiah cried to God, saying, "You have seduced me, and I allow myself to be seduced. I have become a laughing stock. Everyone mocks me." This sounds like a cry of disappointment on the part of the prophet. But when we go to the first chapter of the prophecy of Jeremiah, beginning from verse 4 to 10, God assured or promised Jeremiah, amongst other things, that he will be with him. He will deliver him, and he will set him over nations and kingdoms to pluck up and to break down, to build and to plant. So this promise was made at the time Jeremiah received his prophetic call. But then later on, what did he see and what did he experience? He experienced terror from every side, persecutions from all angles. Possibly the prophet did not think very hard to understand that God's promise of protection does not exclude the fact that difficulties, persecutions, and trials can never be divorced from life. I think many of us should learn from this. That we are on the side of God does not mean that we are immune from sufferings, trials, and persecutions. We must always remind ourselves of this fact, because sometimes we tend to forget. We seem to forget. And this is one of the reasons why we have a crisis of faith. Jeremiah cried to God, as we have in that very reading, the passage we have today from Jeremiah 20, verse 12. He cried to God, saying, "O Lord of hosts, you test the righteous, you see the heart and the mind. Let me see your retribution upon them. For to you I have committed my cause." The sentiment, this very sentiment, is also expressed in chapter 11, verse 20. And from verse 21 of that chapter 11, we see that Jeremiah was making reference to a particular people. He had a particular people in mind. And who were they? The people of Anathoth. Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. Now, when we go to Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 1, Jeremiah describes himself or introduces himself as coming from Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. So, the people that Jeremiah was actually worried about were people from his own hometown. Those who threatened his life were those he least expected to harm him. They were his neighbors, they were his friends, they were from his hometown. And these people were people who have known him from the day he was born. So in this very situation, it was impossible for Jeremiah to determine who was on his side and who was not. Because those he least expected were the ones who were persecuting him. And as he described, the terror was from all sides. So it was difficult for him to determine, to know those who were for him and those who were against him. And that was why he asked the Lord, who tests the mind and heart, to come to his aid. Since God knows the mind of everyone, so this same God ought to know those who were for him and those who were against him. And he did not take the law into his hands. He asked that the Lord should come to his aid. He trusted that the Lord would defend him. A man of faith. In the gospel from Matthew chapter 10, in fact, that very chapter gives us an account of the sending out of the 12 apostles by Jesus himself. Now, remember that in verses 5 and 6 of that chapter, Jesus told the apostles that he was sending out. He was about to send out. He told them not to go to the Gentile territories, but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It suggests then that whatever persecution that this gospel talks about, that is being spoken of, from verse 26 to verse 33, would actually arise from their own people, the brothers and sisters of these disciples, their fellow Jews. So, from the testimony of Jeremiah and from what we have in the gospel reading, one thing is very clear, that the worst kind of persecution anyone could find is the one that arises from persons closest to them. As I said earlier, this should not make us become unreasonably defensive or suspicious of some individuals, of our family members, of our friends, and all of that. What we should hold on to is what Jesus is saying, that we should not be afraid. We should not fear any force, whether it is coming from within or from without. Yes, we may be persecuted by anyone, even by closest friends and family members, inasmuch as we remain on the side of truth and goodness. But the assurance we have is that God will forever be faithful to us. Today is also Father's Day. In some countries, it is observed as so. And I have few words for fathers, just to remind everyone who calls himself a father or assumes the position of a father that your role as a father, your position is already defined, well defined in Ephesians chapter 5 verse 23, where St. Paul says that husbands or fathers are the head of the family or the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. A father is not just the head of the family as he wishes to be or as his culture prescribes. By agreeing to be joined to his wife in the sacrament of holy matrimony, a man, a father, has accepted to be the head of the family as Christ is to the church. And one thing we have to know is that Christ never lorded it over the church. He does not lord it over the church. And so a father in imitation of Christ should not lord it over the family. But he must always see himself as a reputable character in the formation of his children, in providing security, confidence, balance, and affection. So an absent father is one of the causes of violent behavior in children. That is why the Second Vatican Council describes the family as the domestic church, just to make it clear to fathers that they are the visible head of that church. On a day like this, we specially recognize and congratulate all fathers, especially those who are making great sacrifices in their various families. And we pray and wish all fathers well. Happy Father's Sunday. Remain blessed, and let us continue to journey in the light of the Word of God. God bless you all.